The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Finished training for the day? Time to fight post-workout fatigue with Core Power Protein Shakes. They're packed with 26 grams of high-quality protein to build muscle and electrolytes to help hydrate. The nutrition you need to help your body replenish, rebuild, and repair post-workout so you can power on to the next one. Champion your recovery with Core Power. Visit corepower.com to learn more.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn. Welcome to How We're the Podcast. And you join us as we can now see light at the end of the dark, dull tunnel. That is the international break. And we can now completely focus on our next fixture, which is a huge one, because the points on offer against Wolverhampton Wanders this weekend seem more important with every conversation we have around it. So we need to know all about the opposition as usual, and to tell us everything about Wolves, past and present, we have someone who not only has a podcast with a couple of ex-Wolves players, but he's also authored books on the club, as well as being a broadcaster, writer and producer for Sky Sports. And many will recognise him from providing us with the regular updates from across the country every weekend on Gillette Soccer Saturday down the years. It is, of course, Johnny Phillips. Hello, Johnny.
Hiya, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How's it going? Because I know, we've been scheduling this and you've been here, there and everywhere.
Yeah, I was, it's good. I was at Luton Town this morning doing a piece with Jack Wilshere, who's just gone in there in his first managerial role. He likes to do it before training, which is good news because it frees you up for the rest of the day, but it does mean a very early start.
Yeah, and he's just getting his feet under the table there. So I imagine you were one of the first to get inside and talk to him.
Yeah, we were the first in terms of external media. So it was great to have a little chat with him. And I think they're running the piece on the EFL programs over this coming few days and probably on YouTube as well, as everything is these days. So yeah, it was really nice to chat to him, and he's a very engaging fella, in truth.
Yeah, I think he'll do well there. It'll be interesting to see how he gets on. And I do apologise to our regular listeners, because every episode during this international break, I have a little whinge about it. But actually, just listening to you there, going in to see the likes of Jack Wilshere, does it give you the chance to do things like that?
Yeah, it's generally quieter because there are obviously no matches, and the bulk of my time is spent at either Premier League or Championship matches, and they go. So there's a limited fixture list in terms of what Sky are broadcasting, but it does mean that stories lower down the league ladder get a chance to shine. So absolutely, it's good that we can go in and do those sort of stories. The access is always better than it is in the Premier League, and dare I say it, there's a sort of a little bit more humility around the lower leagues, but it's only natural. The Premier League is so big now and caters for so many different organisations that it's hard to be all things to all people. So I see it from both sides.
Yeah, it's been interesting talking to some of our local journalists this season, because obviously the last decade or whatever, or best part of the last decade, we've been playing in League One Championship, and they've just said the difference. Said some, Nick Barnes, who commentates to the BBC, said he could put a sun lounger out when we're in League One in the press room. He said now it's like a scrum. I mean, the jump is huge, not just on the pitch, but off the pitch as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, and staffing levels have to go up accordingly. I remember a few years ago, I think it was one team, it might have been Southampton. It was one of the teams that that came up into the Premier League at some stage, and I think they went from somewhere like 3 to 9 media staff. in the space of one summer just to cater for everything. And it's bigger and bigger. I think the overseas rights now are actually bigger than the domestic rights in terms of the deal. So there's a lot of overseas broadcasters to cater for. Where was I? I was doing the Palace Liverpool game a couple of weeks ago, and there was a whole series of international broadcasters doing post-match interviews there. Far more international broadcasters than UK broadcasters. So it's fascinating to see its growth, and that's a real success of what the Premier League has done.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that the changes going on at Sunderland. But I mentioned in the introduction you've got a podcast, and that's with Robbie Dennison and Andy Much, who I remember playing against Sunderland at Roker Park. So how did all that get started?
And it's great to talk to someone of the same vintage, Chris, because we've got a podcast called Muchie and Deno, and I was a sort of child of the 80s, so they were part of my favourite ever Wolves team, the team that Steve Bull took from the 4th division up into the old 2nd division in old money as it was then. And Andy Much and Robbie Dennison were a key part of that. Muchie was Bull's lesser-known partner, and Robbie Dennison was a Northern Irish winger, very gifted, mercurial talent, who ended up staying at the club about 10 years in all. And anyway, we did an event to celebrate Bully's 60th birthday last May, I think it was, because I do some work for Wolves Foundation. And we got a load of his old teammates together and did a big stage show in Wolverhampton with a few hundred, maybe 800 people there. And Muchie and Deno, as they are known, turned up and were on great form. And they're really good mates, and they've stayed mates down the years, but don't meet up that often. And Robbie Dennison, who's now a postman, spoke to Andy Much after the event, and Andy Much does floor fitting and other stuff. So they both work in normal life like most people. And they said, why don't they get together and just have a bit of fun and do a podcast? And they asked if I'd host it and produce it. And I was only too happy to get on board because it's good fun to do. Everyone's got a podcast these days. I've never had one. And it's great to hear the two of them get back together. And we meet up in Wolverhampton, where we get these recording studios and record 3 or 4 at a time. But as I say, it's in its infancy. It's only a month old, but they're really good company. And it's definitely, for me, a labour of love.
Yeah, that's it. I've been very lucky being able to, through this podcast, to talk a lot, to my heroes of the 90s, like Dennis Smith and stuff like that. And you just in awe of some of these people because you were growing up. But I want to get back, circle back to that beginnings when you first started getting into Wolves, because I'm all over that era as well. But I want to talk a bit about your journey on, where kind of ended up being reporting on the games. And I read you studied media at university and started out on rugby. So how did all that lead up to working in football on Sky Sports?
Yeah, I worked for a press agency in the pre-internet days in Leeds. And we had all sorts of different outlets: football, cricket, horse racing, greyhounds, rugby amongst them. We used to do those old 0898 phone lines with information. Do you remember Club Call and Team Talk?
Unfortunately, I remember getting into bother for those.
I was the Team Talk generation, and we had a successful England cricket commentary that we did through the forerunner to the ECB, which is the TCCB, called Rapid Cricket Line. And we used to rely on people ringing them up from work and spending a fortune. So I was involved in that press agency, and I did all sorts: greyhound results, horse racing results, cricket commentaries, football, a little bit of rugby. It was all there. And then slowly got into local radio. Down in Yorkshire, there was Viking FM, Minster FM, a few others covering Grimsby and Scunthorpe. And then eventually I got the odd gig on TalkSport, which was in its infancy in those days. And then just a job came up at Sky that one of the ex-Team Talk employees told me about, and I went for it. It was a fairly junior job, and it was in production. It wasn't reporting. So I had to make a step down. But I knew that once you got your foot in your door at Sky, then it was up to you to just get on with it. So I took that chance. That was a long, long time ago, and slowly worked my way up from different programs. I suppose Soccer Saturday is the one that I've done the most down the years. But when Jeff Stelling left that a few years ago, we all had a bit of a reshuffle. There was a few people left, a few people stayed on in different roles, and I moved across to the live football. So it's been a good stint at Sky. And obviously, They cover all the football, so it's been the place to be for sort of domestic football.
Yeah, I remember that club called Do and Me when they linked Sunderland with Karol Poborski, I think, under Peter Reid, and I just had to find out what was going on, and never did. But there you go. I read as well, as you were kind of moving through, and I don't know how true this is, but the first game you reported on was at Sunderland. Is that right?
At Sunderland, the first game I did for Sky, you're quite right. It was on Soccer Saturday. I'd never done anything on screen in my life before. Um, and I'd had a couple of non-league matches at Sky where I'd been reporting and not really done myself much justice. And I'd been on Soccer Saturday for maybe 2 or 3 years, but I'd just done the phone reports. And they were keeping me well off screen for good reason, probably. And then one day we had a very senior reporter called Nick Collins, and he was ill or
I
something like
remember Nick
that.
Collins.
And Jeff Stelling just said to the producer, "Why don't you give Johnny a go? He's been here 2 or 3 years, just doing the reports on the phono reports. Give him a crack, sink or swim, let him go and do it." So it was up at Sunderland. I think it was Sunderland. Oh, I want to say Sunderland Leicester or Sunderland Ipswich, and it was in the mid 2000s. Yeah, and it was brilliant. It was at the Stadium of Light. I just remember it being brilliant, and I was very scared to go on screen because I didn't think it came naturally to me. But I just kept it simple, and and the rest went from there. So yeah, you're right. Sunderland was my first on screen reporting.
I thought for a second I'd gotten that wrong for a second as you were trying to think back. But just on Gillette Soccer Saturday, because I remember when it all first started. And when it all first started, there was almost a few people kind of laughing at it almost because it was such a weird thing that these people were sat there watching the games on your behalf on the television rather than the radio, which was the only way back in the day along with teletext, I suppose, for the 3 o'clock kickoffs. But it's strange thinking back that thing that people were kind of uneasy about became such an important part of, I suppose, the football culture in this country now.
Absolutely, it was. You're right. I'm with sort of you in the background of sort of growing up with the radio being where you went for 3 o'clock Saturday coverage, being it commentary or match reporting, and the idea of a television there doing the same thing just seems superfluous. What's the point? We don't need to see these people. We only need to hear it. If we're not watching football, we don't need to see these people telling us about football. So at first, you're right. I remember when it first came through before I worked on it, it looked a bit strange and jarring, but the rapport between people soon took off. And I grew up watching Grandstand in the 80s, Des Lynam, all that sort of stuff, and the 90s. And then to think that it ultimately saw Grandstand off and replaced Grandstand as the Saturday football show was incredible, really. And I think a lot of that is down to the sort of the characters involved. Certainly Jeff Stelling was a huge part of that as the sort of anchorman and the conductor of it all. But I just think it did capture a bit of imagination. It also coincided with pub opening times as well. Pubs staying open all day and it being on in the background. It was very much a show that's on in the background in a lot of places. As many people who sit down to watch it, there are just as many people who are comforted by the fact that it's on in the background and they can turn around and within 10 seconds will see their team score without having to pay any attention to the updates. They just know the scores rolling along on a ticker or flipping around on the side screen. So it's a combination of both. It's a sort of comforting background, and then it was just a bit of pub chat between 12 and 3, and then match reporting that was never sort of seamless and perfect. It had its rough edges and it's had its moments, but I suppose that was its success in a way. And during that period under Jeff Stelling, it got very, very big.
Yeah, I never thought anything would replace the Vidi printer. But it came. And what always used to frustrate me as well was when people used to report on it and the camera was on. You used to see whenever you got a glimpse of the ball in the background, you're always trying to imagine what was going on. But when you watch the likes of yourself, I always watched that, as a youngin, just thinking it was almost a dream job when you watched it. But I can't imagine it being that glamorous if you peek behind the curtain based on one or two stories we've had for the likes of Keith Downey when we've spoken to him. But it must have been fun considering how long you did it for.
Oh, it was amazing fun, and you felt you were in the place to be on a Saturday afternoon. You felt at the epicenter of football coverage. We were never at the most glamorous games because the four lads in the studio got the big ones. So we were more often than not down in the Championship or even below. And you're right, if you peek behind the curtain, there were some, fairly grim walks up to various gantries at certain clubs that weren't the most modernised. And it was just you and a cameraman and trying to make the most of it. But as soon as you put your headset on and you tapped into the studio at 2:45 and you heard them all, chatting away and having fun, and then the games kicked off, it was just brilliant. It was just so much fun to be part of that. And sometimes, a goal would go in, you'd be at a game, a goal would go in, it'd be the only goal for about 10 minutes. So you'd be allowed to sort of chat a little bit about that. And at other times, a goal would go in and you'd have the director's assistant screaming at you saying, you've got 5 seconds, 10 seconds to get in and out of this. Be quick, but we need to be somewhere else. And that was the part of it. And that's probably led to that sort of frantic, shouty nature of trying to get as much information into 10 seconds as possible before they wanted to whiz around somewhere else. But yeah, they were good days.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned some of those dodgy walks up to the gantry. I mean, I remember some of them being really close to some of the fans, and some fans playing drums, like just yards away from the person who was reporting. I mean, you must have had stadiums where you went, oh, okay, that's an easy one. And somewhere you maybe got the assignment, went, oh, actually, I'd rather not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to name a couple, Blackpool had the drummer. We used to be at the back of the stand at Blackpool, and we just had to get on with the drummer, and that was part of it. They had a bit of fun with that. Walsall was a very tricky gantry to get up to, and the view was an interesting one, basically looking out over the M6. And that was that always stuck in the mind. Portsmouth was probably the most scary gantry to climb to. That was just a vertical ladder up a side of a stanchion all the way up through a hole in the roof. I am a mild vertigo sufferer, and I just never looked down. There were these tricky places. And then there were certain grounds that couldn't accommodate you in a stand, and then you'd be pitch side. And that would be, for a while, I don't know if you remember it, for a while, we ended up covering Gretna in the lower leagues of Scotland. They went on this incredible rise up from the Scottish Third Division to the Scottish Premier League with a fella called Kenny Duker, who was a doctor, a part-time footballer and a doctor who scored all the goals. So he even went through a period of going up to cover Gretna, and I used to go up and do that. And you were literally just stuck to pitch side by a barrier with the fans. But it was all part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I think famously, you reported on the Watford-Leicester playoff semi-final game where there was, of course, the penalty, and it was saved in the last minute, and then Watford went straight up and scored. I mean, I'm assuming that's top spot. I mean, does any others stick out other than that one?
No, that was probably by far and away the top one. I've never known anything like that. It was quite incredible. The lads in the office said I had a schoolgasm, which sort of summed it up really. I started off quite high pitched at the idea of this last minute penalty sending Leicester through. So by the time it had been saved and the rebound was saved and Watford had gone up at the other end of the pitch, I really had nowhere else to go. So my voice inevitably broke, and all pandemonium sort of broke loose after that, with flares going off, pitch invasions, everything basically. That tops it, I think. The other great bits were just covering the stories, really. That in the week we'd go over to various places. I went over to the Scilly Islands, which are about 2.5 hours off the coast of Cornwall on a boat, and they've got the smallest league in the world there. There's just 2 teams who play each other 20 times a season, and we went and covered a feature there. That was brilliant. Yeah, it was fantastic. We went and had a great time on the Scilly Islands. There are other places that we went to the Isle of Arran in Scotland, where this team claimed to have the worst team in history that hadn't won for 18 years. So we ended up covering them. Just those little quirky stories, they were great to cover, and real good fun. And Jeff Stelling had a happy knack of picking them out. People had used to write to him. There was the one team, Welshpool, in the League of Wales, had been on a terrible losing streak, and Jeff took the mick out of them. And the manager wrote to Jeff and said, "We're struggling for players. Have a bit of sympathy, please." So we sent Chris Kamara and Paul Merson to go and play for them. We got them registered, and they ended up playing for them to help out. So it was things like that, which were just as much fun as the matches, if not more fun.
Yeah, you just reminded us of the dancing in the streets of Total Network Solutions one, which is awesome. But you know, we're talking about all these memories, all these things that came out of it, and it is an ingrained part of football culture now in this country. But you know, with the likes of social media, modern technology in general, do you think there's still a place for Soccer Saturday and people's habits on a Saturday afternoon? Because actually, I look at the next generation coming through. I look, you know, my son's coming into that, and they're all doing things on YouTube and looking, you know, at different things. They're not sitting in front of the television watching people talk about what's happening in a football game.
Yeah, my boy, of the two of them, who's into football, he's a big YouTuber. He's watched the highlights and the goals from the Premier League on his Sky app way before Match of the Day. He has no connection whatsoever with Match of the Day. So it is absolutely changing times. And I think the key is just to stay relevant and try and embrace what's changing while not losing the fabric of what makes it so much fun and why we're all in it in the first place. But it's incredibly challenging. It's a really, really challenging environment now. As you say, the pace of change is frightening, really.
Yeah, competing with the whole world on social media now. But let's move into you being a Wolves fan in terms of you growing up, because I read you were born in Liverpool, so I'm assuming that, you know, it's something the same as me, where it was just passed down to you, and it was kind of, you had no choice really.
Yeah, it was. It's really it's a really sort of threadbare line that gets me to being a Wolves fan. My dad's from Dublin, and when he moved to the UK, he moved to London with his mum. And they moved near Tottenham's ground in the mid-50s, 1950s. And he just went to watch a match, and just by chance, Tottenham were playing Wolves. Wolves happened to be a good team. They lost on that day, but they happened to be a good team. They won the league 3 times in the 50s. He loved the name. He loved the gold kit. So he sort of stuck with them whenever they played in London. And then he moved to Liverpool to go to university, met my mum, and settled down and lived there ever since, from the age of 18 onwards till he died. But growing up in the 80s, I really should have picked one of the 2 best teams in Europe, Liverpool and Everton, who took turns to win the league and took turns to win in Europe. But I just asked my dad if I could go and watch the team he was going to watch. And by chance, he was a school teacher. By chance, there were 2 other school teachers in Liverpool who were also Wolves fans in his school. They were from there. So the 3 of them used to go off to matches, and I used to hop in the car with them, and it was great. I mean, I wouldn't swap it. They've had no success, but I wouldn't swap it. I had a childhood hero in Steve Bull, and that's all I could ask for. So it's been a great journey, and then getting to know the club well and work with them on a professional level has been fantastic.
Big news. Sephora is now on Uber Eats. So if you find yourself facing a beauty emergency, like needing a last-minute gift, or you're just out of your favorite mascara again, don't panic. We got you. Order now and get $10 off on Sephora orders of $50 or more on the Uber Eats app. Order now. Offer ends October 30th. 1 order per customer. Additional terms apply. See app for availability. Delivery fees may apply.
My marathon isn't about time. It's about my 26 friends with intellectual disabilities I'm dedicating each mile to. I'm Joseph. I'm running my first Bank of America Chicago Marathon for Special Olympics Illinois to help give my friends a place to shine.
Join Bank of America in supporting Joseph's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportjoseph. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America. References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation.
Well, there were. I mean, you know, you talk about, they probably looked at fondly now, those days where they went all the way down and bounced all the way back up, and Steve Bull being top scorer for 9 straight years and all this. But actually, at one point, Wolves were in a big mess at that point, weren't they?
Yeah, they went bankrupt twice in the 80s, in 82 and 86. And the second time, the first time it looked salvageable. The second time it looked dead and buried. So, you know, in one of the books, I interviewed the reporter at the time who covered it, and I interviewed a few players who were involved in it. And some of the stories were just shocking. You know, there was once where the coach had to drive a minivan full of players to play at Grimsby, and there was no food, and they got fish and chips afterwards, and the club wouldn't reimburse him for the fish and chips. Then there was a talk that they were going to swap places in the Vauxhall Conference, the non-league, with Enfield, in order to say if Enfield paid a few quid to the Football League, so the Football League didn't lose money. It was just, there was all sorts of crazy stuff going on, but somehow they came through it. I mean, the last time they came through it, it was very much at the 11th hour. It was sort of 5 minutes to the deadline when they found a rescue package with the council and a few local builders who bought the land around Molineux. But yeah, it was as bad as any club's got without disappearing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because it went completely the other way with Jack Hayward, didn't it? And then during the 90s, I remember it was Wolves splashing the cash in the second division, including taking Don Goodman off us, by the way, for 1.3 million, which I was devastated about. But I mean, unbelievable players, spent tons of money. Tony Daly, Steve Froggatt, Jeff Thomas. And for a good while, I mean, I think it must have been best part of a decade. You always just seemed to miss out on the playoffs. I think you got beaten in the semi-final 3 times or something.
Yeah, the 90s were grim in their own way, because Sir Jack Hayward came in, rebuilt the ground, and threw a load of money at that. Gave managers like Graham Taylor and Mark McGee sackfuls of cash, and it just never happened. They lost to Bolton in 95 in the semi-finals, and Palace a couple of years later, and they never, given the money they spent, they should have got up. Really, there was a famous game actually at Sunderland where Jeff Thomas got knocked by Lee Howie. Jeff Thomas in his pomp, and he never ever recovered from that. And it's that's very much one of those what if moments. If we'd have had Jeff Thomas fit, what might have happened? But I think he went back and was sent off there a couple of years later for scrapping. But that was one of several turning points in the 90s. If only we kept Jeff Thomas fit. But there you go.
Yeah, I think there's a bit about it in Lee Howie's book. I think he got sent, I think it was about 4 minutes to go. And I think Jeff Thomas had come on as sub. He replaced Don Goodman, I think, at half time.
Right.
And
he scored a wonder goal. I know he went on a run from the halfway line. And then a few minutes later, he just got stied down by Lee Howie.
Yeah, it's a good bit in his book about that. But yeah, and then obviously going to Mick McCarthy, took him, went to Wolves after he was at Sunderland, had 6 good years. But after that, you slid from the Premier League to League One, which Sunderland copied a few years later, funnily enough. But with Wolves, it only took 4 years to get back to the top flight. And the way they did that, especially that last part of it, going up from the Championship, had a lot of people pointing fingers at Wolves with how they did it. It was a little bit controversial, but if you look at it, it's led to the longest stint in the top flight since the late 60s, early 70s. So I doubt, many Wolves fans really care how controversial it was.
No, not at all. And, to set the scene, they were bought by a Chinese investment conglomerate called Fosun International, who had a stake in George Mendes's agency, Chesterfield. And basically, Mendes became an unofficial advisor for the club, installed Nuno as manager, helped us sign Ruben Neves, Diogo Jota, various others. And that was it. That was in the Championship. Can you imagine Jota and Neves in the Championship? They just tore it up. And then when they went into the Premier League, they immediately signed Raul Jimenez, Joao Moutinho, Adama Traore, several others, all from the Mendes stable. And it worked a treat. Wolves, they had 2 7th-place finishes. They finished in Europe, and they certainly gave us the best days of my lifetime. But obviously, it's controversial because the manner of it points at a sort of conflict of interest and all sorts of other things. But that was the model that they decided. And had they stuck with that model, they might have been all right. But slowly, it's changed, and the sort of the investment levels have dropped. And the quality of signing has sort of has been diluted over the years, and it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle since Nuno's days. But that model for a short time worked a treat.
Yeah, and actually, it was Sunderland who stopped Wolves getting over 100 points that season.
Yeah, that's right. Right at the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had to run 99 points, and on the last day of the season, Sunderland finished bottom. And we won 3-0 bizarrely on one of the strangest days in Sunderland's history, I have to admit, going down to League One and beating Wolves, who were far and away the best side, 3-0. But as you mentioned, since then, you mentioned the 2 7th-place finishes, Europa League football, and I think since then, Wolves have finished between 10th and 16th. Is looking at Wolves, because obviously Sunderland aspire to be the likes of Wolves, Palace, having long stints in the Premier League. But are Wolves the perfect example when you ask the question of what's next? When you get promoted and you're there for a bit, but then at some point you hit a ceiling.
You do hit a ceiling. I think the owners realised that there was only so far they could go. And what's annoyed supporters since then is that instead of trying to stay with their heads hitting that ceiling, they've sort of pulled back quite significantly and now don't seem to even have the ambition of finishing 7th and 8th, but just appear to be wanting to not so much tread water, but keep their head above water in the Premier League. That's one grievance that the fans have with the current owners. It's surprising. I guess a lot of it's to do with the world we live in, particularly on social media and a lot of the sort of polar narratives you get and the sort of the way discourse works these days. But I'm surprised to some level how much Wolves fans have turned on the owners. I think they've made a lot of mistakes since the Nuno days. I think they've got a chairman who, when he talks, doesn't always speak to the fans in the language that someone who runs a club should. And I can see why there's a lot of dissatisfaction at Wolves amongst the fan base. But maybe I'm just too old in the tooth. I remember the Batty brothers who were the owners who took Wolves to the brink of extinction twice. I remember the wasted money of the 1990s and the Sir Jack Hayward era. And I do still look at Fosun as the best owners the club has had. But if they're not careful, a lot of that goodwill that they had early on will disappear if they're not seen to be investing more in the club. And this summer, the last of the real world-class players in Mateus Cunha left. And now they've got a squad which is not as good as it's been and is arguably the weakest squad in this current Premier League run. So it'll be interesting to see how they cope this season.
Yeah. Well, looking at last season, Vitor Pereira took over from Gary O'Neill last December, and Wolves were 3 points adrift of third bottom Ipswich Town. That was after 16 games. And he did a fantastic job to stabilise things last year. But going back to before a ball was kicked this year, what were the fans' expectations? I mean, were they raised a bit by, because I think spent best part of 100 million, I think it was, or were they just thinking, right, hunker down, it's going to be a tough season ahead?
They were definitely raised because in the summer there was a strategic shake-up of the way Wolves operated. Matt Hobbs was moved on, the sporting director, and Vitor Pereira was allowed to bring his own football director in called Domenico Tetti. And there were suggestions that Gestafoot were getting more involved again. George Mendes' right-hand man, Valdir Cardoso, became a more visible figure down at the training ground and was back on board. And it looked as if they were going back to the old model with Pereira, who is, of course, a Mendes client, leading the way. So everything pointed towards change and everything pointed towards them making the necessary change. But the signings they brought in were just so late. They just brought them in so late. And I'd still think a couple of them will come good, but not all of them have been an immediate success simply because they've come in so late. There's definitely players, 2 or 3 in there who are Premier League ready, but there's another 2 or 3 that need to step up because Wolves are short.
Well, that's interesting to listen to, because obviously, 7 games played, Wolves still looking for their first win. But I was going to ask you about that, because you're talking about players settling in. And if we take the opening day defeat against Manchester City out of the equation, I mean, the other games have seemed quite close on paper. Maybe the Leeds one was a bit of a blow. But the last 2 games, certainly you've seen improvement, draws against Spurs and Brighton. So have the performances been that?
Yeah, the performances have definitely improved since Leeds. Leeds was the low bar. That was what Wolves will hope is going to be the lowest point of the season. They didn't turn up. They looked miles off the pace. But against Brighton and Spurs, they were good for large periods. And you could argue that it was only Pereira's tactics that cost them in the end. They switched from a 4 at the back to a 5 at the back in order to protect the lead. And they ended up sitting deeper and deeper and deeper. And in the end, particularly against Brighton, they allowed so many crosses into the box, so many crosses into the box that ultimately you can't hold out. They were withdrawing it back into themselves with 20 minutes still to play. They were making those substitutions. It was too long to try and preserve a 1-goal lead. So you could argue that Pereira got it wrong tactically. But performance-wise, there was absolutely the shoots of recovery there. The Czech centre-half, who can also play in midfield, Ladislav Krejci, looks a fantastic buy, absolutely fantastic player. He could be. I think he's certainly the best player that Wolves have at the moment. And that there were others who stepped up for a bit. John Arias, who played in the Club World Cup tournament in the summer, he had a really good first half. So there were certainly signs that Wolves were being competitive, because that had been missing in the opening games, and a lot of that was down to the fact that the players had come in too late and clearly weren't Premier League ready at that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talking about that with the performances being there, because you think, well, 7 games played into a season looking for the first win, you think it's panic stations. But has the manager got enough credit in the bank from last season, or is he really under pressure?
So. I hope he has. I mean, there are some who are starting to question him, but I think that's just the nature of modern life. I think, you'll know what it was like in the days before the forums and social media, and I think there's a lot more. The moderates are at the ground. The moderates are in the pub maybe afterwards, and there seems to be a lot more pragmatism, circumspection around Pereira. You go onto Twitter and you go onto a forum and it just looks like the end of the earth. But I think that's possibly not that's not the sort of the true gauge of where he's at. So I think Pereira retains a lot of support. And on a personal level, Wolves can't keep swapping managers anyway. That's not working. The problem is further above. That it comes down to the investment and the quality of recruitment. They've changed managers far too frequently since Nuno's days, and it's not worked. So there comes a point where they've got to recognise that maybe the manager's not the issue.
Yeah. It's funny. We were talking about, we had an on this week that we do, historical one every week, and we were talking the other week about how people had to put in effort to write a letter, put a stamp on it, and send it to the local paper to actually voice their grievance. But now everyone can do it with a click of a button. But just on that, in terms of the playing Sunderland away from home, I mean, could this be, the one to kind of, open the floodgates up on those calls for him to go if Wolves don't get a result? Because it's almost, as much as I love Sunderland, I imagine the other Premier League sides are thinking, well, if we don't get a result there, then where can we get a result?
Yeah, the next two, Sunderland and Burnley, are the ones earmarked by supporters. Absolutely. If you're playing two of the teams that have just been promoted and you're still looking for a first win after those two games, then I guess Pereira's position becomes very questionable. I think it's a good fixture in that Wolves are away from home. I think they're better away from home. There's certainly less pressure from the stands to perform. But without knowing the ins and outs of Sunderland this season, it's hard to say. I actually went to the playoff final. Sky had a table there, and I couldn't. Don't take this the wrong way, but I came away thinking, how have Sheffield United not got into the Premier League? They just looked in total control, and then obviously the scenes at the end were unbelievable. I was with my boy, and he said he's never seen anything like it. He doesn't support Wolves or Sunderland or Sheffield United, and he just thought it was the most incredible sight he'd ever seen. That full Wembley and the celebrations from Sunderland players and fans at the end, will live with him. But I came away just thinking, how have Sunderland got promoted? And then you look at them this season, and they've been really, really good. And so much of what they've done has been a lot to like. So I can't really speak on how they've managed to do that. You know that far better than me. But don't think any Wolves fans are thinking Sunderland are going to be that soft touch that the team who comes up through the playoffs very often is. I think they're well aware that Sunderland are a different beast than the one that finished last season.
Yeah. Well, you said you're more confident about this Wolves side away from home. Does Pereira normally have a different setup away from home? And I was going to ask, because it's Sunderland and there's so much pressure on getting a result, do you think that's going to come into his thinking to set up a little bit differently to go and get a result?
I think where playing away falls into his hands is that his game plan has always been to draw the opposition out. He wants the opposition to press and play through the press. Now, it's quite dangerous if you haven't got the personnel to do it. And there are a couple of times, particularly against Leeds, where the centre-back, Agbadu, just gave the ball away and they scored from it. But his whole strategy is based around the opposition press leaving gaps that can be exploited. And then it becomes quite a quick back to front transition. And last year, obviously, we had faster players in Cunha and in Ryan Aït-Nouri and Nelson Semedo who could do that. There's less pace in the team to get Wolves up the pitch quicker than there was. So it's become more difficult. But that's the strategy. It's to invite the press and exploit the gaps. And I think that works away from home just by nature. I think, when you're at home, you aren't pressed as much as when you're away from home.
Yeah, that's interesting. It could be a game of chess then on Saturday, because I don't think either side particularly want possession of the football, and we kind of so it could be one of those battles of attrition where either team are waiting for the other to do something with the ball or to actually go for a press, and it's this kind of who blinks first. It might be a case of that on Saturday. Possibly.
I find Sunderland a hard team to judge. A couple of times I've seen them this season. Only on highlights, and they've looked phenomenal. And then a couple of other times they've looked like the team that that's just been promoted. And it's hard to say, but they seem competitive. They don't seem to be a team that ships hatfuls of goals and is out of games quickly. And I think that's all you can ask for to some degree at this early stage of the season when we're still in October. So the fact that they've found a way to be competitive as quickly as they have should be a warning sign to Wolves, because if as we saw against Leeds United at home, if we aren't playing at the levels we can do and should do, then Wolves will be punished.
Yeah. Well, after those couple of draws, do you think Wolves fans are going to be travelling up thinking, yeah, actually we should be kind of at least getting a draw? Or how much confidence have Wolves fans got based on those performances?
It's hard to say. It is hard to say. I don't think I think Wolves fans would be incredibly disappointed if they came away without something. But they know that Sunderland are a decent team and aren't a pushover. Burnley at home the following week as well. I think the danger for Wolves is that if they don't get anything out of Sunderland at the weekend, then that Burnley game just becomes almost an intolerable pressure. So as much as anything else, they've got to take something away from Sunderland just so that Molineux becomes some sort of place you can operate in. Because I don't think what the atmosphere will be like if they come back with a 3-0 defeat from Sunderland and then don't start well against Burnley.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking back and previous games don't have a lot of bearing on the upcoming game, of course. But I think looking at it, Wolves have won twice in the last 17 or something, stretching back to 1981. So I'm going to clutch onto that straw for a little bit. But have you got a good feeling? I mean, based on the two draws, do you think Wolves are good for a point?
That's hard to say. I've been to two of those games that you're on about in that record. I went to Roker Park in the mid-90s when we lost 2-0. Loved it. I actually went in the home end along the side. I stood along the side and went undercover because the away end was sold out, and had to jump around twice when Sunderland scored. I've always been all right in the wrong end at football matches because I haven't got a black country accent, so it wasn't too bad. And the second time I went was at the new stadium when I want to say Wolves lost 2-1, and I just remember Niall Quinn's Disco Pants being sung at top volume.
Last minute goal by Niall Quinn,
yeah,
I think.
That was the game. Yeah. And again, both days were really impressive for different reasons. I loved going to the old Roker Park and I loved the atmosphere at the Stadium of Light, but we've never really had much change out of your place. And then when you start reeling off 3-0 defeats when we have a 99-point season, I can't say I'm massively confident for the weekend.
Yeah. Bizarrely, those games, we were talking about it the other day. Andy Melville scored in the one that you're talking about at Roker Park.
Right.
And then in successive years, he scored own goals in 2 successive games against Wolves, in the 2-1 and the 3-1.
Wow.
So he had big parts to play in it. But yeah, that 95 one was Peter Reid's first full season. And so it was Peter Reid against Graham Taylor, of course. Andy Melville, Phil Gray scored for us. And Jeff Thomas sent off on 86 minutes.
We didn't get much change out of that one at all. But it was great to go up and experience Roker Park. That would have been, obviously there's lots of grounds that have disappeared. I never went to the Dell at Southampton, which has always looked quirky on telly. But I'm so pleased I got up to Roker Park because that was one of the great theatres.
Yeah, I went down to the Dell and it was one of the worst coach journeys of my life. But that's a completely different podcast. But yeah, just very quickly, any plans to get up to the Stadium Light with the live stuff?
I'm working there on the Monday Night Football in early November. Is it Everton at home?
It sounds right. Yes.
I want to say the 3rd of November. You've got Everton at home on a Monday night, and I'll be there.
Yeah, that sounds right. We've got Newcastle within the next 2 months, so I'm just focused on that.
So yeah, that won't be the one that all fans are looking forward to. But I'm looking forward to getting back up there. I've not been to the Stadium of Light since the lockdown season, when I covered a live game there during that season. So it'd be nice to get back in there with fans. Actually, no, I tell a lie. I did get up there with fans last season, very, very early on, I think. I'm getting confused. Anyway.
It's amazing because I think a lot of journalists are saying, "No, we haven't been to the Stadium of Light for the best part of a decade," and it's kind of
I definitely covered them in the Championship and below. I think you played Hull City in lockdown on a live Sky game that I was working on.
Might have been the opening day of the season, actually.
That rings a bell. And there was another one. Oh, there was a 5-0 against Southampton?
Oh yes, of course. Under Tony Mowbray.
Yeah, that was it. That was the last time I worked there.
Yeah, that was it. That was a good day.
I worked at the 5-0 against Southampton, but it'd be good to get up in the Premier League and see them against Everton.
Well, that's it. If last time you were there was a 5-0 win, let's hope you bring some more of that magic against Everton.
It's not this weekend.
Yeah, we'll save it for this weekend. But that is a good place to finish on. So just leaving to say thank you very much, Johnny. We really appreciate your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Really nice to chat.
Good stuff, and hopefully see you soon at the Stadium of Light against Everton. But thanks again for everyone for listening. We'll have all the build-up, of course, to the Wolves game on the Roker Report website, and of course our daily releases on How We're the Podcast, where another pod, of course, should come tomorrow. So look out for all of that. But from us, it's bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
You open the fridge, there's nothing there. So what's it going to be? Greasy pizza? Sad drive-thru burgers? Dish by Blue Apron is for nights like that. These are the pre-made meals of your dreams. At least 20 grams of protein, no artificial flavors or colors, no chopping, no cleanup, no guilt. Keep the flavor. Ditch the subscription. Get 20% off your first 2 orders with code APRON20. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.